My name's Lex Dow. I'm with the Monto Grains Marketing Cooperative. So what you've had to say is very pertinent to what we do. We're at the moment looking at carbon capture and storage in soils and doing a study with USQ on this subject. And we've been told there is a vast difference between labile and non-labile carbon. Could you just explain to us what's the difference between labile and non-labile, please?
Yes, I certainly can, and this afternoon we'll explore that a little more in the workshop. Labile carbon is formed when organic matter decomposes in soil. It's very short-lived. It has wonderful properties in terms of improving moisture holding capacity and feeding bugs and helping the soil food web to run. But as a general rule, it will return to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide within 12 to 18 months, depending on climatic conditions. It is not a stable form of carbon. It is not the way that you need to increase carbon for carbon accounting purposes. So what we talk about with having, the reason that we're using the perennial cover cropping as our main way of storing carbon in soil is that those perennial grasses have mycorrhizal fungi associated with their roots. Those fungi take soluble carbon from the roots out into the soil matrix, and it's very rapidly humified. So that under perennial grasses managed appropriately, up to 60% of the carbon that they fix can be exuded into soil, into the cytoplasm of the hyphae of mycorrhizal fungi, and can be humified. 80% of that can be humified within 12 months or less. So that is the way that originally perennial grasslands built topsoil. So when you look for the best soils in the world, wherever you want to look for really, really good topsoil, it's under areas that have been perennial grassland. And it's because of the mycorrhizal fungi that live in association with those grasses. So if we only have plants there for a few months of the year and then bare soil, we won't have those fungal populations to be able to build humus. So humus is what we want. It's stable for hundreds of years to thousands of years. Labile carbon, probably 12 to 18 months.
Can you comment on pyrolysis process and using agrichar or using pyrolysis?
Yeah, the question was, could I comment on the process of pyrolysis for producing agrichar? As far as I'm aware, the experiments that I've seen with agrichar have been very positive, but that is a much more expensive process than having a change in land management where you have plants that are sequestering carbon continuously and feeding biology in the soil continuously. You can make agrichar, but you have to transport it, you have to apply it, and all of those things use greenhouse gases to perform those functions. I'm talking about using, enhancing natural processes to make soil as soil has been made for millions of years.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. We'll just make this a bit of a protocol when we do have questions. If you can just identify yourself and any affiliations, everyone knows who's asking questions, and that's great. Thanks, Margie.
Thanks, Peter. Christine, Margie Milgate from Growcom. One of the issues that's been really hard to sell this whole carbon sequestration agenda to bureaucrats and a whole lot of people is that we can't measure it. So you're bringing in an accreditation scheme that must have some measurement things that's really quite accountable. Can you explain how that's going to work?
Yes, we have been battling with bureaucratic system for something like 10 years, trying to get funding in order to go out and measure carbon, with no success, because we were told exactly the same thing as you were told, that it's hard to measure and all of that. So we were lucky enough eventually to find a philanthropist that was prepared to back our project, and we now have 38 measurement sites across Australia, and we have 3 reasons for doing what we did. The Australian Soil Carbon Accreditation Scheme was, one, to show that you can build carbon by moving towards a year-long green type agriculture, number 2, that we can measure it, and number 3, that those landholders involved in that scheme will be rewarded for that. So the price that is being paid for the carbon under the Australian Soil Carbon Accreditation Scheme is $25 a tonne CO2, which is pretty much where Garno is looking anyway in his final report, and that equates to $91.75 a tonne for the carbon that you build in your soil for the actual carbon. We haven't had any problems at all measuring carbon. It's been very, very straightforward. In fact, most people have had soil carbon on their soil tests for several decades. If you look at a if you look at a comprehensive soil test, it's usually got carbon down the bottom. It should really be right at the top, but any comprehensive test will have carbon. The difference is that a normal soil test is taken on the top 10 centimetres or top 15 centimetres to give you an indication of how much available phosphorus and nitrogen and those sorts of things you have from a plant production perspective. We want to know what's in the top 110 centimetres of the soil, because that's, well, in fact the carbon sink is larger than 110 centimetres, but we're finding changes all the way down to 110 centimetres. And obviously if you only measure the top 10 centimetres, you're only going to be paid for a fraction of the amount that you're building. But if you take soil cores that are 110 centimetres deep, and you were to have two paddocks side by side, say 20 hectares of trees compared to 20 hectares of under perennial pasture, and you were to take 20 cores in that paddock and then measure 20 trees on exactly the same grid pattern as you used for the cores, so that you don't get to choose the trees, they've got to be on the same grid pattern. You'll find more variation in the amount of carbon between those 20 individual trees than between your 20 individual soil cores. So the point that's made that soils being variable, it really doesn't stack up. And also we're finding, interestingly, that across a really wide range of environments, from hot, dry sand, which they call soil, but to me it looks like beach sand in Western Australia, through to much higher rainfall, deeper, more loamy type soils in the east, we found a very consistent pattern in the rate at which carbon can be built. And we're hoping that there'll be a very simple formula that we can use, so that we don't have to be running around taking soil cores all the time. But the other thing is that in the United States they've now got several machines that they use that are just sort of like a quad that runs over the surface of soil and gives you a 3D picture of carbon at depth, so that there'll be much more rapid assessment techniques. But remember too that at the moment, under the current legislation, you can designate an area as a carbon sink forest, and you can be paid for the carbon in that forest as an estimate. It's not measured, it's just estimated on the basis of other data that's been collected about trees. And yet when we say that we want to have a carbon sink grassland, and we're going to measure the carbon, not estimate it, we're actually going to measure it, people say it's hard to measure. So you'd have to think there might be some vested interest there in wanting plantation forests rather than carbon stored in agricultural land. To our something that's going to work in our favour is issues of global food security, and the fact that we don't want agricultural land to be converted to plantations. We need to produce more food. By increasing the amount of carbon in our soil, we can produce more food from the same area of land, and also the nutrient status of that food will be higher, because all of the soil test results that we have from anywhere I've seen on the same patch of land, wherever carbon has been increasing over time, all of the trace element availabilities have increased as well. Things like boron and zinc, copper, selenium, and that means that, for example, if we just looked at wheat growing, that means that the concentrations of trace elements in the grain are going to be higher, so that in human foodstuffs they're going to be higher, so our immune systems are going to work better because we have more nutrient-dense food. So there are so many positives to doing this, but we also have huge vested interests in us not doing it, because people would like to see the money that should go into agricultural production and should go into increasing soils be channelled off in other directions. But we're winning because the senators have now come to see what we're doing, and they're very impressed, and are currently looking at changing the legislation so that everywhere that it says carbon sink forest, it's forest/grassland, so that we can have carbon sink grasslands as well. And that'll be the first step to then looking at carbon sink every other kind of agricultural land, but we have to do it incrementally. I'm sure we'll win the war though.
I know we've got more questions. I'm going to call a halt to questions now. Christine has a workshop this afternoon. There's also a field trip tomorrow. So those of you interested to find out more, and I know there'll be many of you, those opportunities are there. Could we thank Christine for her very interesting presentation, please?